Tom, over to you.
Right. Well, firstly, you're all very welcome to tonight's talk. As regards our speakers, Andy McGrandle, bless you. We've met you a few times. You've done a talk for us back in April 2017. That was the original LIDAR talk. You did one for us back in March 2018 on Charles Dawson, and then you did another LIDAR follow-up in September 2022. I'm glad to see you brought along one of your colleagues with you tonight, so it'll change things up. Welcome, Paul Tate. So over to you guys. You're all very welcome.
Okay, so thank you very much to the Institute and to Tom and Graham for allowing us the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what we're doing as part of an organisation called LIDAR, which is the Leighton Buzzard and District Archaeological and Historical Society. It was founded in the early 2000s. Two groups joined together to do so. This is a latest project that we're involved in. It's trying to discover the location of what was once a famed holy well in old Linslade. What we're going to do over the next hour or so is to tell you a little bit about where we are, why we're there, what we found, and some of the technologies that we've been using to try and help us in the archaeological exploration of this particular project. And then I'll come back at the end and tell you some of the latest findings that came out in October of last year at the end of the digging season. So where are we? We're on the Beds Bucks border outside a strangely named place called Leighton Buzzard. It's about 45 miles northwest of London, just beyond the Chiltern Hills, halfway between Oxford and Cambridge. And the site itself, as you can see, was noted on a number of Victorian maps, Ordnance Survey maps, and one on the west bank of the Grand Union Canal at a village called Old Linslade, which is kind of centered around an 11th century church of St. Mary's, and we're on a rolling meadow that leads down to the Grand Union Canal. Now, Old Linslade, today, if you come down here, there's a church, there's a manor house, which has been converted into some very desirable canal-side properties, but there's only about sort of 8 or 9 other properties in the area. That wasn't always the case. 800 or 900 years ago, this was part of a royal manor in Saxon times, owned by a number of royal queens, one of whom was the first wife of King Edwig, and later Queen Edith, who was wife of Edward the Confessor. After the Norman conquest, it was granted as a land to Hugh de Beauchamp, the Baron of Bedford, a French knight. And by 1086, when the Domesday Book was published, it recorded Linslade as having a mill and 33 households. That might not sound very much today, but it was actually among the largest 40% of all settlements in the country. The church itself, St. Mary's, was constructed around 1100. It was built on the site of an earlier wooden Saxon church. It sits on the edge of a water meadow around the River Ousel, which runs through the town. And by the time it got to the kind of mid-1200s, it was pretty much a thriving community. In fact, so much so that King Henry III granted the lord of the manor, William de Beauchamp, or one of the descendants of Hugh, the rights to a weekly Thursday market, plus an 8-day annual religious fair for St. Mary. So it must have been a very busy place, drawing people from the local lands around to be able to populate such an auspicious occasion every week and every year. And by the late 13th century, there was a lot of recorded knowledge about something called the Holy Well, which had a rising reputation for its so-called miraculous healing powers, particularly apparently waters that helped with conditions of the eye, but also and income. I mean, at that time in history, the church was, how shall I put it, some members of the church were certainly exploiting perhaps more ancient sites of sacred reputation in order to be able to perhaps merchandise in some ways and certainly help fill the coffers. And there are reports of regular pilgrimages, both from a local Minster church, an old Saxon church, one of the oldest in the country, in Wing, which is not very far away, and from the various priories at Dunstable and Chicksands, which are also in Bedfordshire. However, this didn't go down well with everybody. There's a bishop called Oliver Sutton, who in 1299 decided this wasn't appropriate, and he made moves to ban visits to the Holy Well. And he demanded that the local vicar to be brought before the Archdeaconry Court to cease activities on pain of excommunication. You can see from the extracts of his letter, he wasn't pulling any punches. It has come to our notice in a certain report of some persons of inconsistent faith meeting together from various parts by reason of a pilgrimage at a certain field in Linslade, rash claims of miracles, a profane place we wish to abolish under the penalty of excommunication. And the vicar seemed to be more eager for riches than salvation of souls, and he should be brought to court as quickly as possible. This was successful, and that censure closed further demands or further popularity of the well, I suppose, officially. Couple of things to bear in mind here. Oliver Sutton, if you talk to Lincoln Cathedral, which I have done, and the archivists, he wasn't a very popular prelate. He was very interested in ensuring that the coffers of the diocese, and it was huge, as you can see from that map on the left, it stretched from the Humber all the way down to the Thames, one of the largest dioceses in the country. He was very eager to ensure that the amount of income was protected as much as possible. Linslade at the time, the church there, the vicar, actually wasn't appointed by that bishop, so he wasn't very happy about that in the first place. It was actually run by the priory at Chicksands, which is further into Bedfordshire. What's more, he was also the bishop who oversaw the construction of probably one of the most impressive churches in Bedfordshire at the time, All Saints Church in Leighton Buzzard. That has an enormous 173-foot spire. It was consecrated in 1288, only about 10 years before he brought the vicar to court. And it was really a statement of diocesanal control and authority over the area. However, after this particular court case, he died just 5 months later. But the local vicar, Hugh de Hargrave, he continued in his position for another 20 years. So it didn't do his career any harm going through this process. The other thing to note about Hugh de Hargrave, we found some records of his household inventory in the mid-1280s. And it was quite impressive for a little local vicar in a small parish in the edge of Buckinghamshire, Bedfordshire. He had 3 beds, he had a number of tunics, he had a very expensive lamb's wool cloak, and he had a silk pillow and a couple of gowns. One of was worth apparently 10 shillings at the time. The other one was twice as expensive at 20 shillings. Now, if you think back to the sort of late 1200s, 20 shillings was the same as the wages for a skilled tradesman over about 100 days. So he was doing quite well out of all of this. And the other thing that's happened is that we've got records of donations continuing to be passed through to St Mary's in Linslade over the next few hundred years. At 1500s, Henry VII's Queen, Elizabeth of York, was sending money there, Queen Anne in 1700s. And so despite the fact that the well was apparently closed down, it continued to be a place with a spiritual reputation. However, the location of the well itself had been lost for quite a long time. This is a couple of reports from Victorian historians, first of Lipscomb in 1847, talking about a spring of ancient celebrity undoubtedly caused the place to become noted. It's interesting to note what he says here about ancient celebrity. The church did have an opportunity, perhaps, to take places that were linked to sort of sacred sites, places of some spiritual significance. And water sources were well known throughout prehistory and the Romans and the Saxons as being places where people tended to go to worship in many ways. And what Lipscomb was saying was that even though you can't see it anymore, back in the 1840s, it was situated in the northern part of the parish, near the church, near a cottage on the western bank of the canal, a little north of the bridge leading into Linslade. Now, the map at the bottom left, you can see there is a mark of a building, which is exactly in that position on the edge of the canal, opposite the church. On the right is a screenshot from a notebook, which was from G. Gurney back in 1915. And he says that an old cottage and garden are remembered to be on the exact site of the well. And the actual basing of the sacred spring, it's more of a sacred spring than it is a well. I mean, we're not looking for something which is necessarily a circular hole, brick-lined or anything like that. It was more of a sacred spring. And he said that it's probably marked by 2 sandstone blocks which remain on its edge. This is where we are. These are the 2 trenches that we've dug. We're exactly in the right position along that side of the canal. The bridge is to the right-hand side of this picture, and the canal goes up towards Birmingham on the left-hand side. I'm going to go in a little bit more detail about the excavations now. We started this before COVID. We were looking particularly for the cottage because that would give us a kind of basis on which to work. We had a couple of years of delay, but over the following 2 years, we managed to expand the trenches significantly. And this is where we were by the time we stopped digging this year in October 2023. I have to say, from the previous couple of pictures you will have seen, we're very close to the canal. We're in a water meadow. It's at the bottom of a hill, so the water runs down. It's a sacred spring, and it's England. It rains a lot. So our biggest challenge in this terrain is flooding. And it wouldn't have been possible to do any of this project without the help of a couple of local organisations, one of which is Grundfos, the pump manufacturer, who have a local facility here in Leighton Buzzard. And they happened to get involved in what the project was trying to achieve, and very kindly donated a submersible pump, which allowed us to get rid of a lot of this floodwater, which happens on a regular basis as we go down there at the weekends. And to the local council, who helped to fund the remote generator that powered that. Okay, so let's have a look at where we are with this. You can see here a little bit of a mark of what that cottage may have looked like. It's a single story. It's the brick walls are not deep enough to support much more than that. Probably 3 to 4 rooms, mixed wall structures, mostly brick, single brick, brick and stone. And to the left-hand side, there appears to be a kind of older wall with some ironstone block foundations. I'll come back to that later on. But it was obviously deliberately demolished, and we had to fight our way through about 18 inches of rubble just under the surface. All of the walls are the same kind of height, so that wouldn't have happened if it had naturally decayed. And within that, we found an awful lot of tiles with plugs, holes in them so that they can be knocked into the beams of the roof, and thin glass as well, which no doubt came from a number of thin glass pane windows, and some plaster from the inside of the walls, which showed that it was rendered in kind of pastel colours, as you would imagine from that time. There's also an extensive tiled and brick floor area towards the canal, which is actually quite well done. And we had the bricks dated to the mid-1700s. Possibly a little bit later, but that was a local archaeology company that helped us to do that, and they're specialists in building archaeology, so we're very pleased that they were involved. There's also an unusual cobbled area coming on the sort of southeast side, and that's heading in the direction of the church, so it's worth noting that for perhaps some later analysis. But it's that northern wall that is really noticeably different. So what did we find? As you can imagine, in the rubble, we found stuff which was very close to that dating. Lots of handmade nails and spikes, some domestic cutlery, lots of horseshoes. It was a rural environment. A large iron blade, possibly agricultural. These could be musket balls from the Civil War. There were certainly skirmishes in that field, as we'd done from, we know from previous excavations in the meadow, with found skeletons of horses and spurs from the Civil War. There's lots of bone and tooth. These are not human. These are animal bones from cooking. A broken whetstone. And some clothing materials as well. But a lot of pottery, all 18th to 19th century, and glass as well. And you can see a clay pipe in there too. I mean, you can't dig very far in England without coming across some evidence of clay pipes. But the other interesting thing was, as we dug beyond the walls, we were coming across items of 13th century, not the 1700s, but small shards or sherds of 13th century pottery, predominantly beyond the wall. So this started to suggest that this cottage had been built over a much earlier site, and that there was a lot more history underground for us to investigate. This is the kind of stuff I'm talking about. It's mostly greyware. South Hertfordshire greyware was very popular at the time in this area, and you can see why it's called that. But the other thing we found was some intriguing additional features. A couple of circular features which may suggest post holes. These would be the remains of an upright wooden post, and that was jammed in place with small stones at the bottom. And also this cobbled area, which is really interesting. It doesn't look as if it was as finely worked as the rest of the cottage surfaces. So possibly the cottage had been cut through this. And this leads, as I said earlier, in the same direction as the church. So we're kind of intrigued as to whether or not this may be the remains of a much earlier pathway that led over that cottage site towards that old wall. But before we go into any more detail about that particular trench, let me take you to the other trench, which is the annex trench. The reason we dug this one is because we wanted to make sure that we were hitting the right area, and to confirm that there was activity across that canal bank. If you think about, you know, an annual festival, which would have been centered around the kind of star attraction at the time, a holy well, it wouldn't be surprising if there's other evidence available. And this was remarkable in terms of its finds and some of the structural features that we found down there. These are some stone features. It's unlikely, we've had expert opinions on this, it's unlikely that these are the basis or the foundations of anything too permanent. On the right hand side, you can see some examples of an upright permanent building from that medieval 13th century time. These would have been wattle and daub, upright posts, thatched roofs, nothing that would have survived in such a wet environment for very long. So you'd expect to just see the remains. And there were some evidence of some potholes in this area as well. However, the most likely interpretation is that these were temporary structures. These were the stones around the base of perhaps pavilions or other things that may have been put up at a temporary point, perhaps to serve the festival, the religious festival, or the market. And of course, you know, you'd expect, if you're at a festival, just as you would do in Glastonbury or any other village festival or village fete these days, one of the most popular places to hang out is where there's some food and drink. And surprisingly, in this, not surprisingly perhaps, in this trench, we've got a lot of evidence of vessels and jugs that would have been used to be able to pour liquids of some sort. Unlikely to be the holy water, much more likely to be something more stimulating. These are some examples from historical records as to how they match up. Both of these, even though they're different colours, are South Hertfordshire greyware again. The orange one that you see in the middle there, the way that they did that was halfway through the firing, they'd open the oven and allow oxygen to come in, and it would oxidize the surface so it would become a more attractive color. That's how you get that that orange glow to it. But also you can see on both of these the thumbprints of the potter, making those kind of undulating marks on the sides of both, and some very simple decoration in there as well. We also found a lot of other pottery, 13th and 14th century. This is just a small example of the kind of stuff that we were coming up with. I've got a few boxes of it in my cellar, all the same period. But then we started to find stuff that was slightly earlier. This is 12th century, so this is 1100, about the time of the construction of the church itself, which is just across the road. And then we were surprised in that first year to come up with something which was much earlier, Romano-British. And I'd mentioned that, you know, these places with water sources were renowned for having some kind of spiritual significance through time. So, you know, maybe this was related to that. Certainly we're not far away from Watling Street, so there may have been quite a lot of activity in the Roman period in this area. But then this year we came across the oldest find in the dig so far, which is Mesolithic. This is a microlith core, dates back 10,000 years, so 8,000 BCE. The interesting thing about this is, when I say a microlith core, by the way, this is the Mesolithic period. They used small flakes of flint, so that's what you can see the remains of as it's been chipped off. This particular piece of flint, but it's not the kind of flint you find in this area. It's much darker, much harder. So this would have been brought here from elsewhere, maybe a long distance. Maybe it was carried as a kind of special item because it was so useful in the making of very hard tools. The black flint is renowned for being great for making flint scrapers and blades. So we were delighted to find this. It took the site back 10,000 years. Now about the technology. One of the things that we did recently, over the last few months, was to map this whole site using GPS survey techniques. This is a local archaeologist from KDK again, our local archaeology company, using a GPS survey mapping tool. This can give us a map, a very precise map, up to just a centimetre or two of exactly what we found in its position. This is not just important for our activities at the moment, it's extremely important for the future, because we can then record this and report it and lodge those reports with the archaeological authorities to ensure that in the future people know exactly what we found and precisely where it was. We also did a lot of metal detecting, and as you can see, we found quite a lot of metal, including all of these coins. The metal detecting was kind of confined to a strip, about a 20-metre strip along the canal bank. We haven't done the whole meadow yet. That's something that we look forward to. But there's a lot of coinage here, some of which you may remember from your childhoods, some of which you definitely won't. The Victorian halfpenny, for example, and the Leopold I Belgian 2-cent piece. That's the only one that's been recorded in this country so far, according to the archaeological record. So that was quite a nice find as well. But then we came across gold. I don't know if any of you watch the detectorists, but there's a tradition of doing a little dance by the metal detectorists when they find gold. And this was definitely an entertaining moment in the metal detecting that we did the first year. This is an 1842 half sovereign, 22 carat gold. Worth something between 200 and 300 quid these days. So if you lost this in the meadow as you were strolling down by the river or the canal, you wouldn't have been a very happy bunny. losing so much money, I wouldn't imagine. But much more important in terms of the timing for what we're looking for was this Henry III half-cut silver penny, which was found halfway kind of between where we're digging and the church. So if you'd have thought that, there's a lot of commercial activity going on at a market, or perhaps around the well itself as people handed over donations, perhaps bought some of the merchandising. Holy well water was often carried away in small lead vessels called ampullae, and then taken to wherever they may be used, whether it's to help solve a pain in a relative's knee, or whether it was to bless the fields for a better crop in the year ahead. And strangely enough, just a few miles away, a metal detectorist has found a whole load of ampullae in one of the Rothschild's properties at Ascot. And we don't know where those have come from, but it's not very far away from the Holy Well. So possibly those are related. It would be intriguing to find out a little bit more about that. The other thing that we did was geophysics. Now, this is a technique. There are a number of ways of doing geophysics. The way that we were able to do this in this particular meadow was using resistivity. You can do ground radar, but the area and terrain near the canal, it's very high in reeds, and swamp grass. It's not easy to do a radar survey with the kind of machine which is very low level with small wheels through that terrain. But resistivity works quite well. The way this works is that you have a frame and it sends with spikes on the end, and it sends a small pulse from one spike to the other. And what you can tell by using that technique is whether or not there's something like a ditch, which will give you a very low resistance to the current, or there's something like a wall or some other structure, which gives you a higher resistance reading. And when you start to map that out, you can see the change. Now, a lot of these dark areas are geology. That's just the edges of the underlying geology coming down the hillside towards the canal. What would have been, there was no canal in the days of the Holy Well, obviously, so it would have been running down towards the River Ouzel in the water meadow. But there are some interesting features that have already come through this. We decided that we would have a look at number 2 there, which is a small rectangular feature, which may have been the foundation of something. And we were really looking forward to finding that foundation. We didn't. When we dug that test pit, we found some undulating clay layer, suggesting that there was water flowing down the area. But beneath that, we then found a natural green sand layer. We are in this particular site on the edge of the green sand ridge, which runs from Leighton Buzzard all the way through beyond Bedford and beyond Sandy onwards. So it's a kind of special sand, green sand. It's the kind of sand that makes excellent glass. In fact, it was used to make the glass that built the Great Exhibition Crystal Palace back in the 1850s. And it was quarried all the way around this area, sent by barge along the canal up to Birmingham to be made into plate glass. But we did find a lot of 12th and 13th and 14th century pottery in here. So there was clearly not just activity in the 2 trenches that we'd originally dug, but also as you go out in the meadow as well. We also got some interested locals. The sheep come to see us on a regular basis. They're very friendly. These are the other part of the resistivity results. This is by the roadside. It's a clean area for us to be able to do a resistivity survey. And it did show up a few things that we're going to talk about a little bit more now. But before we do, let me just tell you about LIDAR. This is the key technology which has really helped us create some kind of context to where we are at this site. You can download one of these grayscale photos. It is the LIDAR photo, and it shows you where the canal is there. You can see the road running through, and you can see a little marker as to where our site is. But this doesn't tell you that much. It's very nice in terms of some basic topography, but what you need is somebody with the expertise in the software to turn it into this. Now, this may remind some of you as a lost weekend listening to Pink Floyd in the late 60s, but it's actually very useful indeed for us to be able to understand how the topography works in the area, where the drainage is, where the roads are, what kind of activities in the topography have been happening in the past. And as you can see, that blue area towards the top and the right hand side, those are the water meadows. They're very clearly distinguished in this color picture. Now, the guy who has helped us to do this, I'm delighted to ask to tell you a little bit more about this technique. Andy, thank you very much for your help so far. And do you want to take over now and tell us a little bit more about LIDAR?
Will do. Well, thank you, Paul, for remotely referring to me as an expert there, which I'm not as far as resistivity data goes. And I'm slightly shy of the word anyway, after that great northern raconteur Blaster Bates, you some may remember from a long time ago, who said that the word expert he didn't like either, because he said if you break the word down into its two components, you have X, which is something that has been, and spurt, which is a drip under pressure. And sometimes I feel that way about working with some of this data. But the other stuff I am an expert at, if you like. I do use it a lot over the last 40 years. And Richard Gleave, my former partner here, asked a question about the resistivity later on, you know, that, well, could we make it look as pretty as the LIDAR? Well, the first time I showed LIDAR data, I'll come on to that in a moment in the next couple of slides, but it did cause a bit of a stir. And most people are not familiar with how it's acquired. What is it? Well, it's simply a LIDAR scan of the topography beneath the plane. And some people may have experienced a LIDAR scan from a police officer on a motorway or something, but this way you get the LIDAR data, but you don't lose your license. Because this stuff is a swath of LIDAR survey. It's a beam of LIDAR that sweeps from side to side across the topography that the plane is flying over. Now, those who've been inside a light aircraft will know the thing bounces around quite a bit. So how on earth can you get detailed topographic data from a plane that's bouncing around in the air? Well, that you can see on the image on the right there. There's a GPS base station on the ground controlling the GPS received from satellites. And that becomes a correction you apply to the LIDAR data. Every single point gets corrected with exactly what the orientation of that plane was. It's quite a complex thing to do, and it takes a while. But you do get some spectacular data from it. And one of its great uses, if you go to the next slide, please, Paul. Sorry, the one before that. There you go, that's one. If you can imagine this plane's flying over the ground, and if we start with plane number 3, it's acquiring LIDAR data over fairly flat ground. So you get a straightforward pulse downwards and an echo signal, which is very, very similar. If you're flying over steeper ground, like the second plane along to the left, you get a single pulse with a slightly broader wavelength signal coming back. And if you start flying over trees, well, here's the real joy of LIDAR data. Because if we go to the next slide, which is a better illustration of what happens, you find that LIDAR surveying can see through trees. Essentially, we've got this fabulous picture here, which shows the pulse going down. And as you can imagine, the LIDAR return, the first one you're going to get is from the crown of the tree. You also get the LIDAR beams get through between the leaves, if you like, and they'll encounter the understory beneath it, the undergrowth, if you like. And that gives them another return. And then eventually some beams will get down to the ground and give you the ground return. Well, the eagle-eyed among you may have spotted on the first 2 LIDARgrams, that grey one and the colour one that Paul showed, they have different titles. One was called 1 meter LIDAR DTM, and the other one was called 1 meter LIDAR DSM. There are 2 sorts of LIDAR data. One, you get from the tops of the trees and the tops of buildings and the tops of everything. And the other one, you can see beneath the trees, you can see down to the ground, and you can remove buildings. So essentially, if we go on to the next slide, please, Paul. That's a very, very simple diagram, but that shows you what the two types of LIDAR data are. The green one, the digital terrain model, is the one where trees and buildings have been removed. You might think that's magical, but it's actually quite straightforward and simple thing to do. But first, I'll give you a real world example. A few years ago, well, pre-COVID, there was the largest archaeological LIDAR survey ever been done, which was a 45,000 kilometre square survey done over the whole of the Chilterns. And this example I'm showing you now is not from that survey, because that survey was incredibly detailed. It was a 25 centimetre survey, which means you get a topographic point every 25 centimeters across the ground, which is stunning. When you think of the OS map to work out where the contours go, might be a 25 meter, this little contour interval. Anyway, if you go on to this next slide, this is Danesborough Camp. It's over by Woburn Sands. And from the air, it's actually an Iron Age hill fort. But from the air, you look at that and think, well, you'll never see it. So aerial photography is of little use. Go on to the next slide, which shows the digital surface model. You can see there the trees are now still visible, but we're seeing a bit more of the ground. You can even see the serried rows of trees on the northern side in that blue area where the Forestry Commission have been at work. But you can see other things are appearing on the ground, some little troughs and trenches and things like that. But once we go to the DTM, the next slide, please, Paul. The digital terrain model, well, that just leaps out at you. That's an Iron Age hill fort with the approaches coming up from the northeast there and heading off to the southwest. It's a staggeringly beautiful image of a hill fort. If we go to the next slide, I mean, when you look at it in 3D, as you can do with LIDAR data and lots of other stuff as well, you can see it even more clearly. You can see you can make out the ramparts and the ditches very, very clearly. And those you cannot see from the air without using LIDAR. Thanks for that, Paul. Next slide, please. So back to our area of interest. And I've just put the two DSM and the DTM, the digital surface model and the digital terrain model together. And you can see straight away, well, any trees and vegetation you can see along the canal side and along some of those blue tributaries of the canals cut off the river. They've all disappeared on the DTM map on the right. So have all the buildings, and so have, if you look to the left-hand side, to that great big square compound, which looks a bit Roman to me, but it's not. It's actually a cargo place with lots of lorries parked in it, and you can make out the individual lorries. In fact, if you're a fat bloke like me, you may even, if you stand still long enough and a survey's been done, you could appear on the LIDAR as well as, more than just noise. Anyway, to get rid of the housing and all the buildings, that's almost now an automated process within the LIDAR processing software. It can recognize pitched roofs of houses and the regular shape of things like that and automatically remove them. And all it does is takes the land around the building and essentially it flattens the house out and just grids across that area around it. So on the right, you can still see those ghostly shadows of where the houses were, but they're not stand out like they were on the DSM image. So the trees and houses have gone. Now we can make sense of it. And when I first showed the LIDAR data to the Leighton Buzzard's group, you will see there's a red circle on the DSM on the top left there. That's where Paul's current work is focused. But to the south of that is a blue arrow pointing towards what looks like a simple dimple in the landscape. And you can see the same thing on the DTM on the other side too. And when I first showed this image, you were looking for a site for potentially for the holy well. And that became a focus of interest, and that's where you did the early work. Paul will gladly tell you about, I'm sure, as you already told you about. Yeah, that was actually a little dimple in the landscape, which was full of nettles. And nobody in their right mind goes into a bed of nettles to see what's there. But actually, the LIDAR showed it was a circular depression, and it was a sensible target. And that's what the LIDAR was good at. Giving people sensible targets rather than letting them roam over the entire landscape looking for this little well. Next slide, please, Paul. So here's the current site on the foreground, top on the bottom right there. You'll see the red outline of the current site, and just below it, you'll see the cross of where the Holy Well site was supposed to be on the old maps. This is the 1891 OS map, which has been simply superimposed on top of the LIDAR data, which is another thing you can do with it. You can make it play around with it, and you can make things really easily visible. The question arose from Richard and Glebe and others is that what can we do with the resistivity data? I'm not an expert on resistivity. I'm an expert on other forms of geophysical data, but not this one. But it was a good question, and we thought, well, let's have a play. And the key word here is this was experimental. And I'm sure some of you know what experimental means. We're not quite sure what we're doing, but we're just having a look and see what we find. So here's the outlines of the two surveys, and the first learning curve for me on this three-phase project was, well, where's the data? Because the data, as I found out, is not essentially on a geographic projection. It's related to these squares you see on this map here. There's 10 of them, 6 in the riverside one, 6 in the roadside one, and 4 in the riverside. And the data is acquired relative to those 20-meter squares. You've seen the people going up and down lines, but they're within the 20-meter square. So those don't relate to anything else. You know, they're kind of all related to this map of squares. And to put the data together is like doing a 10-piece jigsaw. You slot the actual sections of data in and hope they look good together. And you have to level them and play around with them quite a bit. And Chris Lockyer did a really good job of sorting out the data in these 10 squares and acquiring it too. So next slide, please. So that's what we ended up with, this sort of grayscale image, which is a standard thing. You must have seen it on Time Team and other archaeological programs. Very common. And I think even at this scale, you can see this strange north-south white lineament and a little T-piece to it on the data. But to a layman like me, I find this pretty hard to follow. What's exactly going on? What's high? What's low? Well, on this map, it's the dark areas are highs and the white areas are lows. But there must be a way to make this better. And that's what Richard Glebe and others were asking. Can we make this more colourful, like the LIDAR data? Well, the first thing I did on the next slide was quickly check, as Chris has done, the local bedrock geology. So are there any big things in here? The deep bedrock. Remember, this is a fairly shallow scale survey. You're not looking at the shallower section, not really the deep. But it was good to see if the deep geology, the Jurassic Amptil Clay Formation, which is a mudstone to the north, and the Cretaceous Woven Sands Formation to the south. And you can see the entire area is within that zone of Woven Sands Formation. In fact, Paul's just mentioned that he found woven green sand, you know, in that little trench they dug on the riverside there. So that all fits together. The next thing was quickly look at on the next slide, the local superficial geology. Remember, we're in a river valley here. We've got gravels and all sorts of stuff coming down through here, and they leave fairly thin lying deposits all over the place. Some gravel deposits are thick enough to quarry, but this stuff was made I just wanted to show you this, not because it's super important, but it means that essentially the riverside's still within the Cretaceous, but there's quaternary clay, silt, sand, and gravel that covers the riverside area, the roadside area, forgive me. And I just wanted to point to the Holocene and Quaternary on the right-hand side, because I'm always in awe of those great geologists of the British Geological Survey who managed to draw a straight line through what they described as sandy mud and muddy sand. It's not the easy. I always think that's on a spectrum somewhere, not a clear boundary. But anyway, the geology was checked out and it looks okay. So onwards now, and we'll continue to the next slide, which shows the grey display as we had on the left there. And we've just simply added one of the things that's very common in the images these days in published papers is shaded relief. It means you're simply shining a sun from a particular direction, here from the northeast, to see what shadows appear on the lee sides of some of the higher structures. Now that, on a very small area, is not great. It's much better on the broader scale LIDAR data. But on a tiny survey like this, it's not the best thing in the world. So the next thing is obviously color. So go to the next slide. And on that one, you'll see there what we've done is just simply colored up that same resistivity data. And in a way, you can see that T-shaped feature is clearly more easily seen on the grayscale data than it is on the colored data. And the problem there is that this color is like Ordnance Survey colors. It's linear in the sense that each color band has is an equal sort of distance between them. That's not how most things in the geophysical world are displayed these days. It's very rare to see that, in fact. So next thing to try was equal area, which is the next slide. Thank you. And that's the same colored data, but with a different color scale. And all that is it's a non-linear scale. It's stretched into to blue and red areas. So it includes more red and blue and less of the sort of slightly boring green, which dominated that previous image. And I have to say already, if you look at that map, you can see two blue areas to the south, which are rectangular almost in shape. They're weird. And you think that might be a potential target. I think Paul's going to talk some more on that. And we've still got that big T-shaped thing, but it's now a nice blue low. But look at what's happening with that blue low in the north. Two of them are merging together and they're forming this almost, again, rectangular area that might be of interest. But as I say, I'm not an expert on that. So that's for the likes of people like Chris Lockyer and others to play with. And in the end, we need ground truthing of all this stuff because it's the only way to go. So there's the sort of the final images of the next slide, please, is the final images of the two to show the comparison. But moving on quickly to the next slide. That's then with some shaded relief on. These are all available, I'm sure, if anyone wants to look. The last phase of this, next slide, please, is to see if we could try any of the filtering techniques on this. Is there a difference between longer wavelength signal being deep, as there is in resistivity and many other geophysical techniques, and is it worth accentuating the shallow? So some might say, well, that first might be showed as Andy looked very bobbly and messy. We can filter the tops off that, if you like, to clean it up. So this is a 2-meter low pass filter. It only lets through the longer wavelength signals. The 5-meter looks like a waste of time, and it may well be. But we've just gone too far. But that's what this is all about. A bit experimental. Try a bit of everything. Next slide, please. Moving on to high pass filtering. That was allowing through the shorter wavelength signal to see what we could see in that. And again, we haven't really looked at this that much. But essentially, I think this is the case for, if we're going to continue the dig there, is me saying we. I don't get my hands dirty at all. I'm such a clean-handed person. But essentially, if the group want to continue here, then this is the sort of data that will give us some clues as to where to go and look. Next slide, please. And these are the extremes, if you like. The vertical derivatives are simply tools to look for changes in gradient, looking for edges to things. And clearly, the vertical derivative is too fine. It needs some cleaning up. The 3-meter low pass data with the same technique applied is a bit too smooth. It's a bit like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears. We've got to find the happy medium here. And the nice thing is, once we've got the data in this form, we can play around with this at our leisure. And these operations take, a few seconds each. Next slide, please. The last one is the horizontal gradient, which is essentially, it's putting edges as the red lines, the red highs you can see on this little map here. And again, looking to the north there, that blue area is taking on a new sort of rectangular feature to it. It's got red lines all the way around it. So again, that might be a target once you can work out what's going on, but it all needs to be ground truth. And it's only the diggers out there who will find the information to see whether this is true. Finally, we can move on to 3D displays. Once we've got the data, we can do the same as we do with LIDAR data. You can make the pretty stuff. Now, these are the sort of things you put in the front covers of reports. But actually, for laymen like me, it's a really nice tool to be able to see the features in the data. I have difficulty looking at a murky sort of grayscale thing when you see what really is in there. But a bit of color and a bit of shady relief and a bit of elevation to the data makes it all stand out. And if you go to the last slide, you'll see you can see the features even more clearly. So at this point, I'd like to hand over this well, has been spurt drip under pressure me. I'd like to hand back to my colleague Paul, who's done a great job of advancing my slides for you, as well as all the fabulous work he's been doing, and he'll wrap up the story. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much indeed, Andy. You can see how interesting that is, though, to be able to convert that kind of LIDAR data into something which is really helpful for archaeological teams to be able to try and focus down on some of the areas which may be of interest. And if you think back to, you know, some of the history I mentioned earlier, that this was a very busy place. You know, what are those features that Andy has been able to highlight that we could possibly explore in the future near the roadside from that roadside data? I mean, if you actually look at the grayscale here, there's not just the arrows that Chris Lockyer has been able to identify, but there are also, as Andy mentioned, there's a couple of kind of look like rectangular features down there on the right hand side. There may even be something circular, which would take us a long way back in history. In the middle here, and if you look at what's going on with some of Andy's LIDAR results, you can see that we've got our work cut out for us. The straight line, I think, from archaeological previous archaeological experience, may well be some kind of service trench, possibly leading from the house at the top down towards what was once a wharf on the canal, but the other stuff is really interesting indeed. So let's just go back to where we've come this year and what we've ended up finding. So I mentioned earlier about the main trench. That's the LIDAR showing where we're digging. And as you can see, there is a definite basin there, as mentioned by Gurney in 1915, that the basin of the Holy Well was next to the cottage and marked by two large sandstone blocks. So we've got the 13th century pottery all the way around that cottage. I want to now concentrate on the left-hand side of this picture because what we found when we started to investigate that older wall on the left-hand side was that it wasn't the same materials as the other walls of the cottage. The foundations of that were worked large ironstone blocks, very similar to the ironstone blocks that we used to build the church across the road back in the 1100s. So was this indicative of a much older structure? It would appear that that was already in situ and that the cottage had been kind of buttered up to these older foundations. And so we explored beyond that wall. And this is what we found. We didn't, you know, if you're thinking this is a garden, it's not like any garden I've come across before. They look as if there are definitely water channels leading from that convergence towards the gap in that older wall, which may have been an entrance. And in the middle of those two water channels was an area which is very stony, the top of which was covered in white flint, almost like a hard standing. We hadn't found that conglomeration of white flint anywhere else on the site. Everything else had been brick and much later. So something was going on here. There are water channels, and when we dug into those water channels, we immediately got down to that green sand silt that I'd mentioned in that test pit earlier on the resistivity target. So something was bringing that silt up from underground and laying it along these water channels, which you would expect perhaps a spring to have done. So we thought we'd have a little bit of a further look into that area. And interestingly, we came up with pottery which wasn't anything to do with the cottage itself. It was earlier. It was 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, but certainly not that late 1700s that we talked about earlier on. One of these pieces is a Bellarmine jug. This is a kind of type of pottery that comes from Germany in the 16th century and came over here. The others are fairly well known, Staffordshire slitware and different pieces of slitware, but it was lovely to find this two-pronged fork, a 17th century artifact. We didn't really use forks very much. It was very much knives and spoons in a lot of the medieval period. Until the early 1600s, when two-pronged forks became fashionable about the 1620s. It didn't last long because they weren't as effective at picking up the food as people would like. So by the time it got to the late 1600s, 1700, people had moved on to three-pronged forks. So this was a kind of snapshot in cutlery fashion, if you like, which we'd managed to locate. Now, these pieces of pottery and this fork artifact were actually between those white stones that lined the water channels. So something was obviously continuing to go on in this area between the early medieval activity and well before the cottage itself. So we thought, well, we'd better have a closer look. And we focused down on the convergence of those water channels towards the entrance in that older wall foundation. And we initially found this kind of circular in the bottom right. You'll see this circular feature among the stones. And so with Richard's help, we dug down. And this is what we found by the end of the digging season last year. We found those very large sandstone slabs. We haven't found anything like that elsewhere. So we're very hopeful that this could indeed be the lost holy well that we've been searching for the last 3 to 4 years. Now, just to bear in mind that this is the right location. It matches all of the historical records about where the well was supposed to be, next to a cottage, in a garden. The archaeological evidence has shown us there are water channels moving towards this hole in the ground, this circular feature. There's a constant water flow in here. Richard and I have dug into this. You have to bail this out as an area every 10 minutes. You can't dig any further without it. There's definitely a water source coming, not from the canal, not seeping in from elsewhere. It's coming from under the ground in this area. But perhaps most convincing for us was when we had a visit from some professional archaeologists, one of whom was Richard Gem, who is a former president of the British Archaeological Foundation, a friend of ours on the team. And he's also an expert in holy wells. He's done a lot of research on holy wells, not just in the UK, but particularly in Ireland. And he's writing a book about it at the moment. And he's pretty convinced that what we have now is the beginnings of the holy well that we've been looking for. So with that in mind, we look forward to the summer ahead. And the only thing we need now to be able to extend the trenches in these particular areas that we've identified, both the annex trench and the main cottage trench, is some good weather so that we don't have to deal with all of the flooding and we can work effectively in the time that we have available in the next season. Have to say thank you very much to all of these people who've been involved, both the professional support, and we also engaged a lot of local youth in our project as well from local schools, many of whom come back year after year, even though they've left that particular middle school. So we're trying to kind of not just educate and inspire, but also give people some professional experience of a different kind of activity to help them in the future. After 2 digs, they get a complimentary trowel, probably the archaeologist's most important piece of technology, and we hope that they will. It'll remind them of what they did here in the future. And that's it. Maybe we've managed to find the holy well. Maybe it's lost no more. If you'd like to know any more information or get in touch with us, you can do so either on our website, lbdas.org.uk, or follow us on Facebook. We have almost 2,000 people following us from all over the world. So hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much indeed for your time. And just in the spirit of the entrepreneurial approach of the original vicar of Old Linslade and how he monetized the Holy Well, we were thinking maybe in the future we should also do the same thing and bottle it. It works miracles. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, guys. That was brilliant. If you have any questions for Andy and Paul, certainly lots of interesting facts and figures there. Learn some new words, Holocene and Quaternary. Oh.
Yeah.
That's
Easily forgotten.
That's the difference between muddy sand and sandy mud. Is that right, Andy?
No, it's an age thing. That the Holocene's part of the Quaternary, so it's just a subdivision. But yeah, that is what I said there is absolutely true. That's how it appears in the BGS, logs and records. It's a muddy sand or a sandy mud, and I just roared with laughter when I saw that. I think, well, how on earth do you draw a boundary between that, and something else? It's just incredible.
Well, I'll start off with one question, if I may. With flooding becoming more common, is there any danger the area you're looking at could completely submerge?
Well, I mean, there's always a danger of that. It's in a water meadow. So certainly if you come to Leighton Buzzard in the middle of January some years, you're lucky not to get your feet wet. But what the key thing I think that question aims towards is, how do we preserve this as we go forward? Now that we've uncovered this, and it's in such a damp piece of terrain, how do we preserve what we've done? And this is something that we want to pursue over the next season, to get some of the experts in archaeological preservation to see it. And to give us some advice on the best way of doing it. Obviously, in such a damp area, it's not easy to preserve structures, particularly when you've dug around them. But it's not a climate change issue. It's because we're a long way from the coast. It's about the kind of weather systems in many ways that could destroy what we've uncovered. So we live in hope, roll on the next climate change convention. Hopefully there'll be some more positive results out of those than we've had in the past.
I think the sheep might do more damage, actually.
The sheep they're not easy to manage. I mean, the other thing about sheep is that even though we try covering this up, they are quite persistent beasts.
Very inquisitive as well.
Yeah.
Paul, there was on some old photos I've seen, there was a concrete marker for the Holy Well.
No.
Is it now time to move the marker?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't a concrete marker for the Holy Well. There is a concrete marker down there. It says water on it. And there was a water pipe built across that meadow that it was a kind of upgrade for the water systems of the houses on the other side of the canal. We have pictures of where that trench was. It goes fairly close to the annex trench, but we certainly haven't come across it so far. And frankly, we don't want to dig it up.
Well, weirdly, a week after we finish this work for you, Chess Valley Archaeological Group contacted me, an old friend there, and he said, "Can we make our resistivity data look a bit prettier than it is now?" And I said, "Well, strangely enough, I do have some expertise in that, So we did exactly the same for him. And the blue line you mentioned that you thought was a utility trench or something, he's got one across this Roman side, and it is. They know where the thing is. It's a great big utility trench. And it's a stonking great blue resistivity low. Right. We had to actually chop it out of the grid because it dominated the color scheme of all their maps, So we actually physically removed it.
Yes, I mean, just by the bridge where that line leads to used to be a wharf where they loaded up the barges in the early 1800s to be able to take the sand north to Birmingham for processing. And it wasn't just used for glass, it was also used in the foundries as well, because you need a lot of sand. So,
Yeah.
you know, we have to be a little bit careful that there's some modern stuff in there interfering with what we're really trying to find.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Could it be the, you were talking about that trench, would it be large enough to allow a person to crawl along it? I'm thinking along the lines of St. Albans Abbey and the reputed underground tunnels to allow the clergy to escape anytime the pillagers were coming.
No. Apart from anything else, it doesn't lead from the church. So that's one thing. The other thing is that a lot of those kind of so-called tunnels were during the Reformation period, because, you know, the Catholics Protestant issue, that didn't happen in the 1300s. That wasn't a fear during that period. So it would be highly unlikely for that to refer to anything like that. But I love the romance of the idea.
I'd just like to say that the holy well was very useful for washing the trowels, actually, when it filled up with water. You could...
There you go.
How do you cover up the work at the end of a season? Do you put sheets down and soil on top to just give it a bit of protection, or what?
No, that's a good question, actually. No, we've tried doing that. We've tried covering it up with a kind of membrane. The trouble is that the water seeps up from underground. So it's not like protecting it from downpours. That doesn't work. So it actually has no effect at all. All it does is attract the sheep to walk all over it and mess it all up. So we've decided we've left it to nature to help us out on that one, because it didn't work, frankly.
So the water bottling idea is not a bad one, then, is it not?
It's
Well,
not, no.
I mean, one of the things that we've also trying to do is to, because they've already agreed to do so, is Anglian Water have agreed to scientifically test the water that comes from the well. The difficulty with that last season was you had so much rain, it was difficult to distinguish between the rainfall and the water that was actually coming out of the well itself. We weren't confident it was dry enough to know that the stuff from that particular well position was pure spring water. So we hope that's why, you know, we hope that this year the weather will be dry enough for us to be able to pursue that as well. Also, it's not our land, Andy. So we don't
have to share it with the landowner.
It might be worth, you know, we could run up some nice geological profiles. I did that for some water wells where I live. You know, they wanted to know what the linkage was, because they knew the depths to the top of the water column, you know, and a whole series of them. And if you can draw up the geological section showing what the geology is doing, and it might be interesting to see I mean, I know it's higher ground to the west there, but, you know, what's actually happening. Is the water flowing down from there, and how old might it be? Because it's not coming very far, and it's not very old water. You know, some water's 10,000 years old. It's from a long way through an aquifer.
I mean, couple of points there. One of them, I mean, a lot of the water in the Leighton Buzzard area comes from an aquifer, which is quite deep underground. The second thing is there are it's limestone and sandstone, so there's a lot of springs coming out at the edge of Chiltern Hills. I mean, this isn't the only one. And there are other springs which are fairly a bit closer to Dunstable, which were used by the Romans for offerings and things like that. We know about those. So it's an opportunistic commercialization, I think, on behalf of the medieval. No, but maybe it has a much longer prehistorical heritage to it as well. I mean, the finding of the Mesolithic stuff was fascinating. Although we do know that the Mesolithic tribes did visit that particular valley. We did a dig about 10 years or so ago across the other side of the valley, and we found a Mesolithic camp with huge amounts of broken flint in there.
Yeah.
As well. So,
those are very dark flints as well. They look like those ones from Grimes' graves.
Yes, exactly.
In Norfolk, which is now part of your area, I understand, isn't it? Norfolk and that and Suffolk. You've got that
we've annexed
well.
Grimes' graves as well. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a linked project for you, chaps.
And interestingly, the Icknield Way, which actually extended originally up into the Wash, as it was a very, very ancient pathway all the way down to Avebury, that just skirts the Chiltern Hills near where we are. So it wouldn't have been difficult to carry those kind of flints along that old path into the area.
Right. Have we got any more questions for Paul or Andy?
We're all drinking wine now.
You have them in a state of shock, lads.
Well, if anybody's in the area in the future and you wish to come down and have a look, we do try and dig on fair weather Saturdays during the summer season. And the links I gave you at the end of the presentation, you can send us a message if you wish to be involved, or contact Richard, and I'm sure he'd be able to put you in touch. We'd be happy to host you.
Thank you very much. Well done, lads. And if you'd like to show your appreciation in the usual way, people, thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity, guys. And good to work with Andy.
We had just
I
about
enjoyed
30,
it. It was a good fun.
Yeah, we had just about 30 people on the call, so pretty good turn. Outside.
Yeah.
All right, I'm good.